Well, I'm back, and my computer will be fixed by tomorrow. Everybody had a good laugh at my expense last week. The little cable in the laptop case that connects from like the main board to the screen was broken. So
And this is a repairable thing as opposed to something you have to get a new computer over?
Yeah, it's apparently not even that hard to repair. It's just not going to arrive back at the shop until tonight, and I told him I'll pick it up tomorrow morning. So
I still think that you were partially to blame for not checking in your laptop. That was
honestly, I've had bad luck either way, though. I mean, when I went to LaGuardia in June, I, like a moron, forgot my computer in the security claims area, and that was in my carry-on. So I decided on Friday last week, I brought a carry-on bag, but my suitcase wasn't full. And at the last minute, I'm like, I'm just going to sleep on the plane. So I opened it up, put in my carry-on bag, and went to sleep. And it broke. So basically, I can't travel with a computer. I just need to have like a computer waiting for me in every destination I go to.
Get a Chromebook or something. Get like a cheap and cheerful Chromebook travel computer.
My kids have used Chromebooks. I'm not a huge fan.
Fair enough. Anyway, we don't want to talk about this because there's lots and lots of other stuff to talk about, particularly POEC. Holy crap. What a week.
Within the last hour, while we're filming this, we're going to try and get this podcast out quick tonight. We're going to try and ride the coattails on this one a bit. I just back POEC, had to get to the hockey rink for my kid, and now I'm back home. Very interesting. And I want to ask you a question before we get into any of the actual analysis. Mm-hmm. You and I have had a policy of not drawing any conclusions in a substantive way until this is over. We've noted things along the way, but in the big picture sense, we have not drawn any conclusions.
And the reason for that is because we are going to subject our own reporting to a third-party review. We got to find someone whom we trust to.
You know what? It's funny you mentioned that. I don't know if we should do a third party. I wonder if we should just pick it apart ourselves.
Ourselves, or get Potter to do it, or someone like that.
We could ask one of our friends, but I honestly think it might be a more interesting exercise for the readers if we subject our own work to brutal criticism.
Well, let's put a pin in that. We'll talk about that later. I don't think we need to talk about that on our podcast. But that's because I don't want to go in and be like, well, we put everything right or we didn't get everything right before we actually have a really full picture of what can be known here.
I will say this though, and this is me. This is why I'm asking you philosophically when we want to start actually drawing some conclusions here. I think our reporting from the time of the crisis has held up remarkably well in the face of POEC. There's at least one thing that I was wrong about, and we can talk about that kind of whenever we want to. But overall, given the situation we were operating in and the wild ride of it, I think our coverage has aged really, really well. And throughout the testimony, it's been an interesting experience for me, especially. And I know I've been watching it more closely than you, but I sort of had a checklist in my mind of things I was waiting to see either proven or disproven. It's just been an interesting experience to go, aha, ding, aha, ding, and then cross. It's been interesting watching stuff unfold. So what do we do? Do we wait for the final report to come out in February?
I wouldn't say, okay, so I mean, I haven't been following POEC because, of course, this has been your wheelhouse, so there's been no reason for both of us to do this. And I would probably want to go back and read everything that we did in February again. I think that if you were to level a criticism at what we wrote and what we published, it would probably be that there was an inference that there was a more organized threat on the ground than I think this inquiry has demonstrated to be so. My impression from not just our reporting, but also from like the conversations that we had and the conversations that I've had elsewhere, was that there was a sense that there was an organized quasi-terrorist alt-right threat embedded in an otherwise fairly benign protest, and that would eventually emerge or become obvious. And no evidence to date from this inquiry makes that sound credible. Now, specifically from the Ottawa stuff, we know that there was a credible threat from Coots because that the RCMP did a wiretap and they raided them before the Emergencies Act was ever called. But from the Ottawa stuff, I'm not getting the impression from any of the evidence that's been submitted to this date that, you know, there were definitely some tough characters. I mean, you reported on that from your own observation. There were definitely some tough characters, some rough dudes present there. but I didn't get the impression that there was a sort of a Proud Boys level organized alt-right group operating behind the scenes in this protest, and that evidence hasn't emerged for me.
I
That I
have
think is maybe not, it's not a criticism, it's just an observation really of what I would say.
I have two things to say in reply to this. I think, when was the last time you went back and read our stuff from February?
I haven't. So this is why I'm saying, like, this is why I'm throwing it out there. From this is very impressionistic, and it's
Yeah.
not just from you, or not just from what I wrote. It's based on the conversations we were having at the time. It was based on other reporting. I was expecting someone at this inquiry to come out and say,
And it was that man.
yeah, or like we had solid evidence that, you know, Proud Boys or someone of that level, you know, the third whatever guard owns whatever fucktardness group was. There was maybe 100 of these people in Ottawa, and we knew that they were preparing for some kind of violent act. They were preparing to do something specific, but there's been nothing to demonstrate that level of organization or specificity to come out of this so far, as I can tell. So I don't know if that's a knock on our reporting. I just think it's just, that is my big picture bird's eye view of what I'm seeing so far.
This is an interesting position for me to be in, because it was primarily my reporting, and obviously I have a vested interest in being right. I have reread all of our stuff. My 3 dispatches from Ottawa. I've read your dispatch from the border in Alberta near Coutts, which was just before the shit hit the fan there too. Your timing was impeccable.
Yeah.
And I've also read the dispatches we were writing at the time. Also, we had a couple of other pieces written by people in the legal community or think tanky community who wrote for us at the time. I went back and I reread all of them at the outset of this, because I wanted to have it all fresh of mind. And I'm going to say to you, I think you used a good word. You said impressionistic. I think when you go back and reread our coverage, you will be pleasantly surprised how careful we were.
We were very careful.
I think we're more careful than your impressions would tell you. And
probably,
I had a really interesting conversation a couple of months ago with someone who was telling me how much they liked my work, and I'm like, it's nice. But I kind of came out of that conversation thinking, I don't think I actually said that. And when I went back and I reread what I'd actually written, I kind of gave old me a pat on the back, and I was like, thank God. One of the things I honestly believe in is doing my future self a favor whenever possible. And there was a criticism that was made against me at the time, which was that I had written things that could not be substantiated, which is true. I was speculating at times, and I was saying stuff that was using off record or on background sources. But the specific criticism that was made of me at the time was that I had said that these protests were being directed or coordinated by foreigners. And
I don't think you actually said that at all.
No, and this at the time, I replied to the individual on social media, and I said, no, that's not what I said. And I said, you are criticizing me based on a narrative that seems to have formed in people's minds. Because I think a lot of people did think there was foreign direction of this.
Well, and that was the implication of what the government was doing. There was a reason why they needed to fund all of these foreign bank accounts, because there was the implication here that this was a bunch of alt-right Americans or alt-right whatevers throwing money into these protests. Now, again, that's not to do with our reporting. We didn't report that because that wasn't our understanding. But that's also not come to fruition. There's been nothing in POEC to suggest that was the case. It looks like the majority of the funding was very much coming from small source donors, at least from what we can prove or see.
It's funny. It's funny. So I was accused, and I was said that, like, this is irresponsible. Gurney is going further than the evidence, is saying that there's foreign involvement. And I just quoted back to my critic here the precise sentence fragment from my article. So let me just read it to you, Jen. I have it here in front of me. This is a sentence describing the so-called logistics camp at Coventry Road. Police are very much aware of the site, and they are very worried about the presence of a hard right-wing organized faction that isn't there to protest mandates and vaccine passports, but to directly create conflict with the government. This hard right element probably includes some non-Canadians. That was the total extent of any commentary I made about possible foreign involvement.
Mhm.
But what I have found in the months since the crisis is that my piece kind of became fused in the minds of people who were really worried about that.
Yeah.
And I have precisely one sentence in thousands of words I wrote from Ottawa, and the sentence is conditional.
And also, I mean, all the stuff that you wrote for us, and this is where I'm being totally fair to you, was based on your own direct observation.
Or the conversations I had
or
with
the
people.
conversations you were having. So, I mean, like, if that was a legitimate concern, like, you didn't create this whole cloth, all right? So this isn't a fault on your reporting, but I would note that there has been no evidence of any kind of organized alt-right group come out of POEC,
Well,
unless I'm wrong. Am I wrong?
not necessarily.
Okay.
What has been referred to repeatedly in testimony, particularly by senior police and intelligence leaders, is the presence of far-right, alt-right individuals and factions within the protest.
Okay.
But they have not disclosed their identity, and it's redacted in the documents.
So
okay.
Fair enough.
Am I right or am I wrong? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, that's fair enough. That's fair enough. So like I said, this isn't me criticizing. This is just me sort of doing a bird's eye impressionistic sort of view of what it is. I think that we were very careful, and I think that you were very, like, both of us, of course, more you than me. I had the easier job. Coots was an easier thing to describe. But we were focusing very much.
Brass balls going there, though.
Oh yeah, but yeah, that's fine. But it wasn't just me who did that. But I would say is that you and I both decided to do very much straightforward man on the ground reporting. Like, this was not, we weren't doing column writing there. We weren't being speculative. We were just being like, look, we're going to the sites, and this is what happened, and this is what we saw. That's it.
What is very frustrating to me, and I was speaking with a colleague about this just by text. We were texting during the testimony today. The final verdict on this now rests in the hands of the historians. 30 or 40 years from now, some keen students will get access to declassified documents. We found out this week when the CSIS director, David Vigneault, was testifying, we found out two things. That there was classified information that was not part of the CSIS brief that was presented to the government that was apparently material to their decision to invoke the Emergencies Act. I don't know if it was like a whole briefing full of information. I don't know if it was a factoid. Like, we don't know. We just know that there was classified information that the cabinet included in their deliberations. And we also know that there was a legal finding of fact or definition, something that the cabinet referred to. And both of those things were withheld. I believe they were.
So it's impossible to actually gauge whether or not the invocation of the Emergencies Act met the legal test.
There is one thing,
the
Jen,
two crucial pieces of information have been redacted or withheld.
Yeah. There is one thing, Jen, I can tell you with confidence that I was wrong about in my reporting. And since we've already, I wasn't sure at the beginning if we were going to go that deeply into this, but we seem to be. So let's just YOLO. Let's do it. I overestimated Peter Slowly. And I had this sense, and this was based not on my gut feeling, this was based on my conversations, that Slowly understood that there was a challenge and he was having a hard time communicating that to other people. And I think that's still defensible, but it's also become clear in everything we've learned since that Slowly completely lost command of this very quickly. And my impression was that he was a man trying to push a boulder up the hill. And I still think my impression of his assessment was largely accurate based on conversations I was having. And by the way, I never spoke with Slowly. Never did. I did not. I'm a national affairs writer. I don't have municipal government contacts in Ottawa. I could, like, if this had happened all in Toronto, I could have done that. I would have known enough people within the Toronto political and policing community that I would have had direct access sources. I didn't in Ottawa. I was relying largely on federal or provincial sources. And I overestimated the effectiveness of Peter Slowly. I don't think I got his conclusion wrong, but the one thing I was absolutely wrong about was I thought he had his shit together more than he did. So I told you before, reading through all the testimonies, like, ding, I was right about that. Ding, I was right about that. The X I give myself is that. The issue of an organized, possibly foreign influenced or led group within the broader movement, I can't tell you. We know,
Okay, so
there was
what's
we know there was a far right faction there. That's been testified to in open testimony and documentary evidence. There were people, specific individuals linked to specific organizations that both the police and CSIS were actively monitoring, and it's in the documents and it's redacted. So I can't tell you.
So
if anyone on the inside wants to give me a call.
What's your takeaway from POEC? What happened here?
That's a fascinating question. Well, let's answer that. Let's answer. There's three questions in one there. Is it legally justified? Will Trudeau politically survive? And what the fuck happened? Which is kind of the question you just asked.
I think that the first answer is unknowable because the key details have been withheld or redacted.
Correct.
2, will Trudeau survive? Yes.
Yes.
3, what happened? Yeah, that's kind of where I'm narrowing in. What actually happened here?
You had the best way of describing this.
Oh, did I?
You did. Actually, you know what? I'll say this. Sandy Garasino of the National Observer has the best one tweet summary of POEC, but you at the time had the best analysis of what happened. You said that the government had been knocked into stun-fucked stasis. That was your exact phrase. And that I think, yeah, no, it was smart. We should hire her. That's kind of my impression coming out of POEC. And one of the things that I wrote, it's funny, I was telling you a minute ago that I overestimated slowly. It's really nuanced because in that piece where I was telling people I think slowly is shouting a warning and no one is listening to him, I was right that no one was listening to him. Because one of the things that's emerged from POEC is all the internal communications. All these guys talking to each other. We've seen their emails, we've seen their text messages, we've seen minutes of meetings and readouts of private phone calls. And something that jumped out at me is how we were remarkably late into this thing, while all the relevant levels of government and all the relevant agencies could not find their ass with both hands and a flashlight. There was stun-fucked stasis, as you so put it there. Nobody understood what was happening. And you asked me what happened. The executive decision-making functions of various levels of Canadian government and various Canadian government agencies failed. And I just don't mean failed as in oops. I mean failed as in became non-functional. And for a period of days, weeks even, were not able to be functional. And I want to make a comment that is me relying on my military history background, and listeners and viewers who have any knowledge of military history will understand what I mean by this. I know this is not really your thing, but I think you'll intuitively grasp it. Every once in a while, you have a unit that hasn't lost many of its men, but if the colonel in command either panics or breaks down or is killed, like maybe the bad guys get a lucky artillery shot on the headquarters tent, you can have a unit that still has all its effective strength that becomes non-functional because the chain of command is disrupted or paralyzed in a way, and there are either not the right personality types or the right procedures in place to come up with a new chain of command on the fly. And I think it's a very technical way I'm describing that, but I think that's what happened in February. There was an assumption, and we can say this with a fact now, widely shared by government officials, that what was going to happen in Ottawa was going to be a protest lasting a few days. I think it is fucking insane that was the function, that was the conclusion, because you and I, in our houses in Toronto and Calgary, we knew better.
Yeah.
So that's an unanswered question. Why did, and this happens sometimes, Jen, sometimes you give someone all the right information and they draw the wrong conclusion from it. I think they assumed
this was going to be another, what's the pipeline protests when all the truckers went to
the Wet'suwet'en?
Ottawa. No, this was the pipeline protest when it was a bunch of it was
Rolling Thunder. When
no,
they
this is
went,
the yellow vest version.
oh,
Remember
okay,
this? And
yeah, I don't remember what that was
and then
called.
Andrew Scheer was chatting there, and then Faith Goldie got up on the stage and the whole deal. I think they thought it was going to be another version of that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. It seems like, and what's interesting though, Jen, is when you actually look at the intelligence information, which is now public. Like this thing is a gold mine for journalists and historians. Like we can read the police intelligence assessments. Quite a few of them are saying, no, these guys are going to stay. You don't drive 3,000 kilometers across the country for a 2-day event.
Yeah.
And these guys, the convoyers, were openly talking about their intention to stay. They were not subtle about this.
No.
And so that was the first failure. When the convoy didn't pack up and leave kind of on Sunday, Monday, as everyone expected, two things happened at once. First of all, because the government, and I'm using that term broadly here, Ottawa, Ontario, feds, whatever you want it to be, the Canadian state generically didn't move quickly, they forfeited momentum. And the psychological inertia and momentum was 100% on the side of the convoyers. And there was no operational plan in place of what to do if they didn't leave. And like I said to you, Jen, in an effective unit, whether it's police or military or corporate or a sports team, like well-led units can pivot on the fly in the face of adversity. This was our plan. Well, that ain't happening. What's the new plan? Let's go, boys. That didn't happen. And what ended up happening instead, and this is remarkable, was about a 10 to 12 day period of stunt-fuck stasis at multiple layers of the Canadian federal government. The initial failure and the worst failures were at the municipal level. The City of Ottawa and the Ottawa Police Service dropped the ball. And
the national commission, the NCC's got to take some ownership there because that was technically their jurisdiction.
It was 100% their jurisdiction.
Okay.
And that was where I think the original leadership breakdown happened, where the stunt-fuck stasis happened first. What happened next was that the provincial government of Doug Ford, for reasons we don't really know, because Doug the coward didn't show up and testify, Ontario just new phone who dis. Like the government of Ontario just went poof, a little smoke, Roadrunner, meep, just gone. So the City of Ottawa was on its own, and it was in complete chaos. The leadership at the police and civic level in Ottawa collapsed into like I said, it failed. Like, and I don't mean oops, it became non-functional for a period of weeks. And I know that people have had the opinion, and this is a little bit the shamrockers on Twitter, but it's also some smart people as well, that the feds were the adults in the room, that they swooped in for the rescue. They gave everybody time to get it figured out. And when that didn't work, they stepped up and they got it done. I don't see any evidence
that there were any adults in the room here.
Looking at the communications of federal officials, which again, we have now, this is incredible. Like we've had more transparency in the last 6 weeks than we've had in the last 20 years.
Yeah.
It has become clear to me that the federal government itself was also stunt-fuck stasis. And it's a little bit different for them because they had no direct operational oversight, especially of the Ottawa information. Like that's 2 orders of government down for them. So I don't blame them for not making good executive decisions at first. It's not their job. But what did astonish me and worry me reading these documents is how little they understood the problem as late into the crisis as they did. So even like 2 weeks into this thing, we can look at like text messages and emails from cabinet guys going like, so is there a plan? Who's running this? Who should we talk to about this?
Well, even I found that startling when I was listening to a little bit of Chrystia Freeland's testimony when she was like, all of the people at Bay Street had to get her in a room and be like, this is making us look like a joke. And I'm going like, you hadn't figured that out by now? Like,
no.
You needed Bay Street to come and tell you that. Like,
yeah. And it's when you actually look, there are thousands of documents. I haven't read a fraction of them yet. Like, I mean, I've read a bunch of them, but what emerged from me really late into the crisis, I told you a couple of days ago that there's those ding moments where something I had explicitly written had been confirmed. So I was in Ottawa, if I remember correctly, like the 7th, the 8th, and the 9th. And it was a document on the 8th or 9th in February, where it was just clear by the questions going around among these federal staffers and officials that they did still not have a good situational awareness of the status of what was happening in Ottawa. That there was a lot of basic stuff about both the protest and the response that they did not know. And again, I do absolve the federal government for not having swift executive action during the crisis, because it wasn't their job.
They were space cadets.
They were clued out. Like,
Yeah.
it was like there was this whole thing happening, and they were freaked out about it. Like, they were talking about it a lot because, whoa, there's all these trucks right by our buildings, and there was concerns like if any one of these trucks had a bomb in it, it could have taken a big bite out of the federal government. It was
but I also wonder to what extent there was a cultural divide that made that space cadetiness. Like, if these were, for example, environmental protesters who had blocked up the streets of Ottawa, I think that they would have been fairly attuned to it. But these people were so divorced from their own political and ideological spheres that I think that they were just kind of oblivious.
I think you're right about that, but I think you're right and you're wrong. I think you're right about their understanding of the protesters, their motivations, who they were, where they came from, how to speak to them.
Yeah.
I think you're wrong. I don't think it mattered if it was like an Elvis impersonator convention or an invasion of space aliens or like an ISIS terror cell. I don't assume the federal government was going to perform any better in terms of understanding and getting a reaction room going. I think one of the things we've seen repeatedly in recent years is that the federal Canadian government cannot pivot in crisis response in a time frame any less than weeks. I don't know what that is. I don't know if that's a cultural thing. I don't know if it's a quirk of the current government. Maybe it's the institutions, right? Like, maybe the chain of command in Ottawa is so bloated and bureaucratic that information can't circulate quickly. I will have to go when we eventually write our kind of definitive piece on this. I'm going to have to go through, get a timeline together, put some actual notes together. But I'm going to, as a ballpark figure now, and listeners and viewers, don't hold me to this, I could be off by a couple of days. I would still say about 2 weeks into this thing, the federal government was still in the fog of war. It's like, well, hey, what's going on? Is there a plan? Who should we talk to? Is Ford doing something? Is the city doing something? Do we need to get involved? Should we be calling people? You asked at the very beginning, this is a very long answer to a very simple question. You asked what happened. I want to add a wrinkle to this.
Okay.
This thing got different when the borders started to be blockaded.
The Ambassador Bridge is what radically changed.
I mean, all of them. And it mattered for a couple of reasons. First of all, it actually kind of, for the first time, directly engaged the federal government. International border crossings are federal jurisdiction. That also immediately presented economic and diplomatic and even arguably national security concerns that are at the federal level in different parts of the federal government that before would have said, Wellington Street's not our problem. This is municipal law enforcement.
Well, except doesn't the NCC federal? And wasn't this one of the competing dispatch? Yeah. Okay. All right. Then that
6 police forces that each own little bits of territory that are not physically contingent.
And so then it becomes easier to pass the buck between, well, this is your problem. This is your problem. This is your problem. Right.
The other thing that happened during when the borders got blockaded, and I want to stress this for you, and I want to stress this for our listeners and viewers. This is not something I can prove. This is something I'm really confident in, but I cannot prove it. Okay. I think private sector industry picked up the phone and called Doug Ford and yelled at him.
Oh, yeah, I'm sure that's the case. Because of course they would.
I think people intuitively know that's probably what happened, but I don't have documents that I can use.
All of a sudden, I'm losing X GDP per day because I can't get, auto parts across the Ambassador Bridge. Now we have basically an international diplomatic and economic crisis.
And it's also the kind of thing that Premier Doug gives a shit about.
Yeah.
He didn't give a shit about inconveniencing a bunch of bureaucrats in downtown Ottawa, but you're shutting down assembly lines. I can
tell you here in Alberta, everybody was just laughing at Ottawa. We were like, haha. I mean, I wasn't, but people were. People were doing that assholes. Yeah.
but Doug Ford gets a call from the private sector unions, the guys running the assembly lines, the
Yeah.
logistics companies that are
Yeah.
laying off workers because they can't run their fleets back and forth across the border.
Now
All
all
of
of
a
a sudden it's a
sudden,
problem.
real fucking quick, the Ontario government's engaged.
Yep.
And so, again, answering your question in a very long-winded way, my main takeaway of what we learned from POEC, and this is a statement of the obvious, is that what happened in February was really complicated. And that was something I really strove to get through in my reporting. There were different elements all wrapped up in that, but I think we can also divide it into two time periods: before borders, after borders. And the before border period is sort of Wellington Street is blocked, Ottawa collapses into complete stunt fuck stasis. The Ontario government goes, "You're on your own, folks. Bye." Justin's problem. It's his capital city. And then there's this weird 2-week period of buck passing and ass covering and confusion and stunt fuck stasis. But then the borders get closed. We kick it up a notch, and that is when two things happened. I think more competent agencies got involved. CSIS, OPP, RCMP. Kind of at that point, they stepped in and took over. And it also forced the politicians to get serious and start communicating with each other. So,
I mean, also, I mean, the weird communication delays and gaps even between Bill Blair and Rick McIver in Alberta was totally indicative of the level of fucked upness of this.
I
Just
would,
the spiteful lack of communication between the federal government and a provincial government reaching out for help really struck me. Paul Wells did a great piece on this. And
I was about to say,
if you haven't read Paul Wells's piece, you should. So basically, here's my very simplistic bird's eye view of what happened here. Truckers roll into town. There's bad information. They stay longer than everybody expects them to, probably longer than a lot of the truckers themselves expected to be able to get away with it.
They
I said
probably about momentum, right?
Yeah,
the longer they stayed, the longer they stayed.
Yeah, and also they probably didn't think they were going to get away with this, but the longer they got away with it, woohoo! We'll set up some bouncy castles and some hot tubs, whatever. This also, the amount of time also gives these elements likely a time for some unknown number of real extremists to begin to infiltrate this group. Yep. And even if it's just 10 of them, like 10 of them can do problems. And of course, if these people are embedding themselves in otherwise naive or unknowing protesters, especially protesters with kids, you can see how this gets ugly real quick. So everybody starts to freak out, but they're in a weird state of stunt crisis. Nobody wants to be the one who accidentally shoots a kid from sitting in a truck. So everybody just winds up going, I don't know what to do, and I don't want to take responsibility. Then what happens is the shit gets real down and out. The borders start to clog up. Industry starts to freak out. The Americans start to freak out, and we know that that's when there begins to be high-level conversations between
Trudeau and Biden talking directly. Yeah,
exactly, and Freeland and I think someone from the American side start to talk directly. Also, just before the announcement of the Emergencies Act, that's when you have the border raid at Coutts, because of course the RCMP finally had enough information and evidence to demonstrate a real violent threat was starting to form there. They raid a nearby house down at the border crossing at Coutts. They find guns. They have lots and lots of evidence to charge people for conspiracy there, and that court case is ongoing. We know that is not made up, by the way.
Yeah.
There is a real violent threat there. That then raises alarm bells about the possibility of a small number of extremely violent actors within the Ottawa sphere, but we don't know that to what extent there for sure. It's impossible for us to know whether or not the legal threshold for security threat was met here. I'm still leaning toward it sounds like it probably wasn't, and that much of this probably could have been cleared using ordinary police forces. But if you want to look back at this more holistically, you have a federal government that's in stunfuck stasis, needs to demonstrate politically and also for its American and other economic actors that it's taking this stuff seriously. And so they invoke the Emergencies Act in order to look tough.
I think you have it bang on.
Okay.
And we will eventually flesh this out in more detail. I want to add a couple of footnotes to that, though, and I agree with your take entirely. One of the interesting footnotes that I wonder about is whether or not the Coutts raid saved Canada. It shocked the right people, and I don't mean the government. One of the themes I wrote about a lot was how there were two groups of people in the Ottawa convoy.
Mm.
The well-meaning, kind of dumb people and the hard men. And I think anytime I or someone else tried to tell the well-meaning, angry people with the bouncy castles that there were hard men there, like, oh yeah, what, you Trudeau, you're bought and paid for media. The Coots raid happens and all those rifles are there. I think that knocked a lot of people. Whoa! We don't want to be associated with this.
Well, and I can tell you that that was absolutely true in Coots.
In Alberta, yeah,
because
they packed up and went
the
home.
Vast majority of I said there were literally two separate blockades, two physically separate blockades, which I think was not understood very well. But you know, in the first blockade, which was quite a bit north of the actual border crossing, it was very. I mean, these people didn't like the CBC, like they were kind of rough and tough, but like. And I was told, like, don't go advertising your CBC appearances around these people. But like, these were very, you know, we're going to have, they'd set up a bar. They, you know, they were doing barbecues. They were doing saunas. Like this was a very,
it was Wellington Street.
It was Wellington Street. And then you physically went a few kilometers south of that and things got real weird real quick south of that. But even there, like you went into like their headquarters and you would had Hutterite women bringing baked goods and kids' pictures on the walls. But then you'd have like guys talking about how, you know, the WEF is going to come, like, you know what I mean? Like it was getting creepy down there. So I can tell you that when the guns were found down there, that was a huge wake up call for the rest of that blockade. And
the northern blockade packed it up.
The northern blockade packed it up. And like, even when the northern blockade packed it up, they were hugging the RCMP officers on the way out. These people were not a threat or didn't want to be a threat. So they all of a sudden went, whoa, no, we're gone. And the only people who were really left out of that crowd were people who started to get really conspiratorial after that and started to claim that the border blockade was some kind of RCMP planned. It wasn't. You know, but even among that group, even among the Southern group, the number of people who had real demonstrable violent intent, you know, I think it was 4 or 5 people. Like it was not the majority even of the Southern group. But the Southern group was a much tougher crowd than the Northern group.
I'm gonna tell you, the listeners and the viewers here, something I've never publicly revealed before, but this is something I was told on background during the crisis, and I never put it into my dispatches because I didn't think it was important. Mm-hmm. But my best source of information on how many actual hard asses there were in Ottawa was less than 20, fewer than 20.
Yeah, that would make sense.
And the concern wasn't that these guys were going to kid up and storm Parliament. It was that they were going to find some yob in the crowd with a sob story, pump them full of Jack Daniels, get them all angry, and then provoke a fight with a cop.
Yeah.
Like that was the concern.
This was not, I always thought that despite all the sort of crazy rhetoric that came out of the convoy stuff, a lot of that was just predicated and rooted in just total lack of understanding in how our systems work and function. I never thought that this was January 6th.
This wasn't a civics class reunion.
Yeah, exactly. Like, and this also wasn't January 6th. I don't think that was the risk. We weren't worried about an actual coup de grace here, but the concern was street violence. That was always the concern.
There's a term in one of my dispatches, small cadre of hardened street brawlers. That was the concern. Not that it was.
And you look at the crowd with kids, especially with kids being in the protester crowd, you can see how that gets real ugly real quick. And there's another thing that I would want to point out here. Not that I'm trying to foment sympathy for the convoyers necessarily, but I do think that this fact has gotten really lost. And that is, the convoyers were not responsible for a single act of prosecutable violence. The people, in fact, overwhelmingly, the convoyers were more likely to be victims of violence. And there were, I think, 2 incidents.
I don't know if that's true. I do know that the Ottawa police have said there was an increase in reported crime.
Oh, an increase in reported crime. Okay, I'm not aware of any actual charges that have met.
No, me neither.
Outside of the Coots situation, I'm not aware of any actual charges. So, but I will say,
you're right about that. Up until the clearing operation, I don't think there were a lot of charges.
Fair enough. But however, I believe there were 2 incidents where the convoyers were mowed down by anti-convoy protesters in vehicles across Canada. I know there was one in Manitoba, and
Manitoba.
Yes, there was a case where an anti-convoy literally plowed into the crowd.
That was in Winnipeg, right? The legislator at the legislature.
Yeah.
Wow, I don't really remember that, but it rings a bell.
I think it was at actually the border crossing down in Manitoba. I have to double
Okay.
check that, but I think there was actually 2 incidents like that. So there were incidences of convoyers being the victims of very violent and purposeful attacks. In hindsight, hindsight being hindsight, but that has been lost in a lot of this as well.
Well, to me, Jen, and this is sort of something that is a through line of all the coverage I was writing, including the first essay I wrote even before the convoy started, because I wrote an essay. You and I remember, this is funny, the listeners might not know this, but we didn't expect this thing to last for weeks. And for personal family reasons, I was not able to be in Ottawa when this thing was starting. And I wrote an essay where I kind of tried to set up the flavor and the mood. And I honestly believed that this thing would blow over in like a week.
Because we
And
assumed
then,
that our governments were more competent than they were.
oh, we know better now.
Yeah.
When this thing was still going on, like 2 weeks later, I remember you and I having a very specific conversation on like a Sunday afternoon where I had not yet decided to go, because we were thinking hour by hour this thing was going to end.
Mm-hmm.
I had dinner with my family on Sunday night, and it still wasn't over. And my son's hockey wasn't on at the time, and my mom was available to help get my kids to and from school. And I called you up, and I'm like, I'm just gonna go. And like Ottawa's like a 4-hour drive, right? Like it's like I'm gonna throw some clothes in the bag, get in the car, and go. And what I just think is remarkable about all of this is, again, first of all, me in Toronto had a better situational awareness of the situation in Ottawa than our federal government did up until that time. What the fuck? Like, I think the RCMP and CSIS probably had a pretty good sense of what was going, but that information was not getting up to the cabinet level, which is something we should think about. And I think to your point about all of this, about the violence and the interpretation of all of this, I still don't think to this day the convoy is well understood. And
because maybe they can't be well understood. To some extent, it was a bit of a mob.
Much. Oh yeah, we didn't, and I think what you were saying a minute ago about like some of the violence heading back towards the convoy. One of the themes of my writing, your writing, and some of the other contributors we asked to contribute is nothing more or less foundational than the rule of law. Because when you lose control, when the state loses control of a section of its territory, the rule of law ceases to function, and everything becomes an exercise in power.
Mm-hmm.
And
that's what was starting to happen.
Yes, and it was Mike Moffat of the Ivy Business School, a housing expert I talk to often for interviews on housing policy, but he also lives in Ottawa. And he and I were tweeting on Friday, and he noted, and God bless him for doing this, he noted that near the end of the crisis, there was sort of like a posse. I don't know how else to call it. A group of Ottawa residents organized by the thousands and closed in on a protest site and dispersed it, while the police sort of stood back and like watched it. You never want to have a powder keg where the only thing that will set it off is your least emotionally mature drunk guy throwing a punch. And that's the situation repeated successive failures of Canadian government allowed this country to get. That's why I said,
and it makes perfect sense, because I mean, even in Alberta, if the police had been unable to open coots over any length of time, eventually some people just would have started showing up.
I remember in Alberta, and it seems so quaint now, the Wet'suwet'en blockades of rail lines. I don't remember if it was Calgary or Alberta, but somewhere.
Yes, it was in Alberta. People just started showing up and dismantling the barricades. Yeah, if the police won't do it, we'll do it.
Yeah, and the
police were freaking out because they were like,
because they're losing.
They're losing control of the situation, but at the same time, that can go bad, pear-shaped so quickly and so easily that
because
they didn't
one
want
guy throws a
shot.
punch.
Yeah, exactly. Bad scene.
And I am let's go deep philosophy here. Not that
right.
I'm not going to quote any dead French people at you here, but I mean core basic foundational philosophy. And this is listeners, viewers, line supporters, we love you all. I'm about to expose you to some pretty deep mat here. So prepare yourselves. Jen, you've seen worse.
Definitely.
Everything that we know and cherish rests on a foundation of security. Every society's first priority is food. Its next priority is security. And they don't care always what that security is. It can be martial law under a dictatorship. It can be tribal allegiances. Like we still hear parts of the world, right, where like, well, you know, like my sister got raped by your brother, therefore you must give us your cousin to rape and then we'll exchange money. Like tribal justice systems. We have parts of the world where there are criminal gangs that kind of have an effective vengeance-based security, right?
Mhm.
In the West, we have police, courts, and prisons. Like, but
And these were institutions that took some time to set up.
It took thousands of years until we came up with the idea of a public police force. Thousands of years.
Yeah,
of
actually, people
history.
don't realize how
No.
recent a public police force, a civilian public police. Yeah, it's not. It's
200
not. It's not even
years.
200 years. I think
what was the London
Act,
force? The Peel
I
Report.
think it was 1867, wasn't it?
I'm going to look it up right now. The Peel Report policing.
The Peel
Let's
Report.
See. Peel Report.
Yeah, it was not that long ago. It was 19th century. I can tell you that.
Why can't I find the damn thing? Because it thinks I mean Peel region. My Google is
London Municipal.
Yeah, there we go. Peel Report, Police United Kingdom. Wow, God, it's giving me all these acronyms. History of Policing United Kingdom. This is such
Metropolitan Police Act of 1829.
Okay, so I was right, about 200 years ago.
Okay, fine.
Here we go. Oh, here
you're gonna math me, man. Fine.
Sir Robert Peel was the Home Secretary in 1822 when he published his report that led to the Metropolitan Police Act in 18.
Oh, and prior to that, just so you know, rich people had police.
Of course, basically they had hired guns.
Yeah, the rich people all banded together in their rich communities and had, like, I think it was some Blue Street runners. They were called runners essentially. That would act as private security for their communities. It was the poor people who didn't have police.
And I mean, think about like. And I know we're getting into complicated stuff here, right? But I mean, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, only a little more than a century ago, was an armed paramilitary light cavalry force.
And that was a stark contrast to the municipal metropolitan police force, for which a lot of our municipal police forces are rooted in. The RCMP, I think, was essentially a gendarme.
They were dragoons. They were mounted light infantry. And you look at the United States, for instance, which where like the Wild West, where you would round up a posse, or maybe if you were lucky, you'd have a regiment of the United States cavalry in your area. That was only about 130 years ago, 140 years ago in some areas. This is where I'm going like deep into staring into the darkness of my soul here. The broader public does not know how fucking recent this is. If human history was like one day, we invented modern policing like 4 minutes ago. And if you lose it, people do not settle for anarchy because we are genetically hardwired to prioritize security only behind food. Only when you have security can you have everything that we identify as modern life: healthcare, education, stable agriculture, democracy.
I need to feel
commerce.
Secure. I need to feel secure that I can send my kid to a group of strangers in a school,
and they won't be abducted by pirates,
and they're not going to be abducted by pirates.
Yes.
And then I can walk to the grocery store, secure my weekly meal billet, and I'm not going to get raped and murdered along the way. Like,
and or even if they spare you because they're chivalrous, they steal your food.
Yeah.
Or, you know, the farmers, when they go into town to like get a donut in a double, they're confident that their crops aren't being plundered. This is not how human history has been. This is this incredible thing that we invented 200 years ago. And we're still haven't figured it out yet, because I'm
And
not
also
one of
this,
these.
and this is also why whenever somebody is being prosecuted for a crime, they're not being prosecuted for a crime against the individual or the individual's family. They're being prosecuted by the crown,
state.
by the state.
Yes, the
They're being
state, the crown, the sovereign. Yes.
because the criminal justice system isn't predicated on ideas of vengeance or payback. That's why there's no blood money in the way
But
that
of
there is in other
justice
tribal
and
societies.
social order.
Yes.
I remember saying this to you a few months ago. I know this is a really grim thing to say, but if you said before, you go to the grocery store, if you're raped on the way back from it, society's response is not to say to your husband, you get to pick one of theirs to rape.
Yeah.
It is that you sit quietly in the courtroom and hand Jen tissues. We arrest the person. We investigate. We prosecute. We incarcerate, and we determine when that person is released.
Yeah.
We were losing that.
If you lose, if you lose faith in that system, and I think there's other ways to lose faith in that system. For example, if your criminal justice system, for example, starts letting people out early, or starts letting like murderers roam the streets after being convicted 48 times with something, people start to lose faith in these systems, and vigilantism is going to be the inevitable result of that as well.
There are valid criticisms of policing from both left and right.
Yes.
Or not policing, but corrections, we'll call it.
Sure.
Criminal justice in this country. We are way, way, way too easy on many violent offenders. And undoubtedly, we have unequal racial outcomes in our system.
Oh,
you want to criticize this from the right? You want to criticize this from left? I'm not saying it's perfect, but holy shit, it's better than what the alternative was, historically speaking, only 200 years ago.
Yeah.
So 200 years ago, there was not a modern metropolitan civilian police service in the Western world as we would recognize it today.
Also, in 200 years ago, a mob like this storming Ottawa would be a coup threat.
Oh, it would have just been immediately dispersed by an army unit, which was be stationed in the capital at all times.
Sure, but that's why a mob like doing this kind of thing. I mean, wasn't there the oranges marched in Toronto, and like all sorts of there's all sorts of stories like this where people were just like, no, there are no peaceful protests. You show up with guns and you take over.
And we call it the militia, and they shoot you.
Yeah, exactly.
Yep, and
that's the alternative.
One of the things, and I know we're switching countries here, but one of the things that was so remarkable to me as a student of history after Jan 6 was seeing 2 combat divisions worth of infantry deployed to the U.S. Capitol. That's old school. One of the things Western societies have done is draw a dividing line between the armed forces of the state and the police of the state. Obviously, they have some common missions and they do work together sometimes. But the police is how the state polices its domestic security problems, and the military is how it fights its external enemies.
That's why the militarization of civilian police forces is
a
problem as well.
And after January 6th, when I saw 25,000 guardsmen protecting the U.S. Capitol, that was why that zapped my head so badly. That was a fundamental breakdown of the basic operating order of a liberal democracy. Some of the European countries are weird, like the Italian Carabinieri or French gendarmes. Like some of the Europeans who have much more recent histories of autocracy blur the line a bit more between the armed forces and police. But the Anglosphere, Western democratic countries, we don't. And I will say this, hats off to the liberals on this one. I am glad they did not use the armed forces, and I'm glad for this reason. You have to keep these two things separate. The police protect the civilian population. The military kills the state's enemies. And
that being said, I don't think it would have been a bad outcome here if the military had supplied some heavy duty equipment.
I could have lived with it, but I'm glad we didn't have to. I'm going to quote Battlestar Galactica here. Or I'm going to paraphrase it.
It's the best primer on politics that you could go for.
It was when Admiral Adama said, he said the police secures the public and the military fights the enemies, and when the government uses police against the civilians, its own civilians become the enemy. And I think that's correct, Admiral Adama. That is why I'm glad we didn't have to do that here. One other point I want to make, though, and I hope the listeners are enjoying this. This is a very free conversation.
We're rambling. We're good. We're fine.
I want to actually give credit to the liberals for something here.
Okay.
I think my reputation as a liberal critic is fairly well established. But
Cook.
I think, I don't know if they acted legally, but I think they acted maturely. Does that make sense as a distinction? I think they were horrifically late to realize they had a problem. I think once they realized they did, they made mostly good decisions. And I would say if we saw more of the prime minister, who testified for 5 hours today in Ottawa, he would have an approval rating higher than 30%. And one of the things that has really jumped out at me,
just really hard to give anyone credit here. It's kind of like giving Anita Anand credit for giving the military pistols.
No, no.
You know what I mean? Like, that's like if everyone had acted even half as appropriately as they were supposed to, given the search situation, it would never have gotten to this, and it could never have gotten to this. And to what extent did the Emergencies Act required to clear this protest? I still am coming away from this inquiry with no certain answer here. I'm not convinced that it was. I think that you could have used ordinary police forces, and the Emergencies Act still strikes me as an overreach. But I also can recognize that there's limitations to my knowledge based on what's been redacted and withheld here, which is in and of itself a problem. So I have a really hard time giving anyone credit.
It feels dirty pinning a gold medal on anyone after this complete shit show. I get it. I will say this, though. You know how I feel about Marco Mendocino. You know how I feel about Chrystia Freeland and Justin Trudeau. I thought their testimony this week was compelling and persuasive. They revealed more thought and nuance than they usually do. And something that jumped out at me in these last couple of days, I want to run through a quick sequence of events here. David Lemeny and Marco Mendocino have had their emails and text messages released. Bill Blair, the same. He looks terrible. There's no good news if you're Bill Blair. But Marco Mendocino and David Lemeny, again, as I've been very critical already, they were weeks behind the curve in figuring out what the fuck was happening. But once they did, I think they responded maturely and rationally. Chrystia Freeland, not that impressed by what we learned about her. She seemed pretty clued out about all this. Justin Trudeau on the stand today, though, made me think, oh, and Candice Bergen, the Conservative MP, who was interim Conservative leader at this time, a readout of a call between her and the Prime Minister has been entered into public record. And wouldn't you know it, she was way more mature and cooperative when she thought it was just her and the Prime Minister on the phone. Her tone was conciliatory, cooperative, helpful, and supportive. And then she'd go on Twitter or get up in the House and savage the guy. And one of the things coming out of this is that all of, like, as mortifying as it must be for them to have all their private communications being aired publicly, they look better. Like, we found out this week that the Prime Minister, who shows up and gives gender equity talking points at every opportunity, can be on the witness stand for 5 hours straight and hold his own. We found out that Marco Mendocino, one of the least impressive cabinet ministers in this Trudeau government's history of really unimpressive cabinet ministers, in private communications, was showing some maturity and integrity. We have seen that Candice Bergen, who I think beclowned herself during the convoy protests, behind the scenes was working to simmer things down and be cooperative here.
So it's almost like the problem isn't our politicians, the problem is politics.
System. That's exactly it, Jen. What the fuck is wrong with our system? We're just like the reasonably impressive man we saw on the witness stand today. Where has that Prime Minister been the last? He kind of tried to be that guy at first, and then he looked at some polls and decided he had to go nasty and wedge. Candice Bergen was feeding her base red meat morsels in public and being cooperative in private. Marco Mendocino,
I don't want to give Trudeau total credit here. He did throw the police under the bus here. He did basically say, like, look, the reason why we had to call the Emergencies Act is because the 73-page report operational plan for clearing the protest wasn't good enough. And for some reason, what we came up with after we called the Emergencies Act was better. Like, there was some buck passing on this one.
Yeah, I know, but I'm not convinced not deservedly.
Maybe. I think we'd have to analyze the two different versions, as Trudeau himself has suggested, to come to that conclusion. But like,
what I'm thinking maybe is,
this was not a man who came out and said, like, look, we dropped the ball and we knew that we had to step up. Like, that was not the Trudeau that came out to
I
testify here.
I'm not even necessarily defending the content of what he said, but what we saw on the witness stand today was not the overscripted talking point delivery robot that has been serving as our prime minister for years.
I don't know. I think it was pretty scripted, man.
I think
I'm not saying it was poorly scripted or that he came off poorly. He didn't. It was a very good performance. But like, this was not the I'm the leader, the buck stops with me.
No, it wasn't that.
We made errors and we needed to like, you know what I mean? Like there was none of that. Let's be clear.
No, I agree with you entirely. But one of the things I've been told about Justin Trudeau by people who know him a lot better than I do, I've never spoken to the man in person. I've been in the room with him at different events, but I've never spoken to the man. One of the things that I've been told about him is that he's actually a lot smarter than he lets on. He's not necessarily as smart as his fanatics think he is, but what he is that he is often flippant and glib, and he is overcompensated to control his errant tongue, which gets him in trouble. The guy who joked about Putin invading Ukraine because they lost a hockey game, or whipping out our CF-18s like their penises, that guy...
Thanks for your donation.
Bingo. He has learned when he goes off the cuff, he fucks up. So he never does. We only get the prime minister in really carefully controlled settings. He does answer questions often in public. This is something Stephen Harper wouldn't do. The prime minister at events will take questions from the public, but his answers are often very much pause, thoughtful nod, pre-approved scripted talking point.
Yeah,
I thought he was better than that on the stand today. Careful. I agree.
But
I think, we've seen that the prime minister is capable of being better than he normally gives us. We've seen that Candice Bergen was capable of doing better than she gives us. We've seen that there's more thought going on among some Liberal cabinet ministers than they go out of their way to convince us is the case. There is something broken in our politics. And two things are happening, I think. One, it's taking, I don't want to say good people, but it's taking people and it is forcing them to give the worst of themselves, not the best. And I think the longer that goes on, you're going to start skewing your sample. Because if the system is so shitty, you're not going to draw good people. You're going to...
I think that's already happened. Happened.
And happening, I would say, because it's a process. The more dysfunctional and partisan and bitter and fucked up it becomes, the more you're going to attract the kind of people who hear me say partisan and bitter and fucked up, and they think, that sounds great. I got to get me some of that.
On that note, Matt, we have been going on for more than an hour about POEC, and I do think there's two other topics that I want to briefly touch on, so I kind of want to pivot unless you have one more other point.
I have one more POEC point to make, and you will enjoy this.
Okay.
I cameoed in POEC repeatedly this week.
Oh, I remember that. That's right. That's right. You did.
And I want to make a serious point. I, in February, emailed the office of the Attorney General, David Lametti, because on an interview with CTV with Evan Sullivan, my buddy, who's just recently took a job in New York, David Lametti talked about the bank accounts that were being frozen. And he used the term pro-Trump to describe these people. And Twitter instantly exploded with, what? So if you're pro-Trump, the government's going to shut down your bank account? I emailed his office right away because I hadn't seen the interview and there was no video of the interview yet. I emailed his office and I said, guys, you're getting, like, I don't remember my exact words, but it's basically, these are the comments being attributed to you. This sounds like it's being torqued to me. Do you guys have a transcript that you can share me? And is there a statement you can send me? If there isn't, can you come up with one? What the documents in POEC were the internal communications in Lametti's office as they figure out how to respond to my email.
That's always fun to get those.
It's the thing that's funny is that we have now discovered that the Attorney General of Canada does not think much of me, which fine. You know what? The feelings
mutual. Yeah.
The feelings kind of mutual on that one. I'm going to acknowledge that. But I actually want to hold this up as a success story because you know why? These guys don't like me. They didn't. They did not think I was going to treat them fairly. That's what the internal emails revealed, where Lametti to his staff says Gurney's not going to care what the transcript says. He didn't
That's
think.
totally not true. That's totally not true.
Well, two things. It isn't true. If I didn't care, I wouldn't have asked for it. And even this is just me as a professional. Even if I'm about to stick a skewer in your back, I'm going to do it accurately. That is the professional obligation that I have as a journalist. Even if I think you fucked up, I will be fair to you.
Well, and that's I think you and I are very much aligned journalistically in our philosophy, because I think even though we're both conservative rightish in our outlook and perspective, we both highly believe in the importance of fairness. And I think
and honesty.
Fairness and honesty and accuracy. And I think that if someone credibly accuses us of being unfair, we take that criticism very much to heart. And I think that you are not going to find more fair, albeit not friendly. There's a difference between being fair and friendly. Yep. You're not going to find fairer or friendlier journalists or fairer journalists than us. We just aren't friendly. And that's the distinction that I'm not sure that these guys can make.
Can I make one more point on this, though? And I think this is important.
Yes.
They got me what I asked for, and they were very polite.
Well, good for them.
And that's why I wanted to say, like, I'm in a weird way, I'm offering this as praise. They don't like me. They don't think they can trust me. They don't think I'm going to be fair to them. I think they're wrong. I think they're badly wrong about that. But despite whatever they might have thought of me,
they still did their job.
They did their job, and they got me the information I asked for professionally and quickly. And even though it is funny almost a year later to take just a little peek, just a couple of internal emails that come out where it's a, hey, Gurney's asking for this, and he saw the interview, and he wants the transcript, and he wants a statement. And Lametti's like, he's not going to care what this transcript says. But then he also goes, this is fine. You can send him that.
Yeah.
So, Mr. Attorney General of Canada, you don't like me and you don't think I'm fair. And I think you're wrong about that. But your office cooperated with me, and thank you for that, because I know you guys were under a lot of stress at the time, and I appreciate that you took the time.
Yep, fair enough. All right. Want to move on quickly. Two things I wanted to note in the news is that I believe Tiff Macklem testified today at the Finance Standing Committee, and he admitted that stimulus spending might have something to do with our current inflationary troubles.
Oh boy,
so basically, he's where we were at. What?
15 months ago.
15 months ago. You and I have written a little bit about inflation. We've had some economists bite back on us and say, no, we've got it wrong. There has been a long-standing dispute among economists, I think, who are torn between saying that the current inflationary troubles are totally global and totally supply chain, totally the result of the supply chain issues that we've been having since COVID. And there have been the economists who are like, no, government spending is a factor here. Like, it's not what Pierre Poilievre is claiming, where we're just printing money, but part of the huge amount of money that we put into stimulus spending in order to help individuals and companies deal with shutdowns during COVID, absolutely did increase the money supply, both directly and also indirectly through, I'm going to get Chris Ragland to talk about this, but essentially indirectly by essentially creating debt on the books for the banks to then chill out. So, and the global supply chain stuff has been global in scope, but so has the stimulus spending has also been global in scope. So where do you say that this amount of inflation is caused just by supply chain stuff, and this amount of inflation is caused by stimulus spending is almost impossible to do. But finally, we've got Macklem coming out and saying, look, it's both. It's both. There is a factor in terms of the amount of money that we've thrown into the economy that is partially responsible for inflation, which is again where we were months ago. And also, so what? What were we going to do? Were we not going to give money to individuals? Were we not going to give money to businesses? Were we going to give them too little? Were we going to let people starve of, lack of access to food? Like, of course we weren't. Of course we had to throw money into the system to deal with that crisis. And it's impossible to know, even with the benefit of hindsight, what the correct number would have been, right? Like, you just can't know this. So a conservative government would have done the same, and it's disingenuous to claim otherwise. But once again,
50 billion stimulus in 2009.
Yeah, exactly. So, but once again, Macklem is really impressing me with his willingness to come forward and say, yep, yeah, this was a factor. This was absolutely a factor. And I give him credit for this, because he has been, as the head of the central bank, he has been someone who's willing to say, you know what, we got it wrong. We miscalculated. We overshot, we undershot. And this is what we're going to do. We're going to be accountable, and I'm going to try and rectify it. And to me, that shows a lot of character for an individual in a really uncertain financial time.
You know what? You're being more mature than I am.
Why am I being more mature? That never happens, just so that we're clear.
Bit of Roland version. So I did not watch Macklem's comments. I often do, especially these days. 2 years ago, I would not have watched a live stream of the Bank of Canada governor like proceedings.
And now it's fascinating. Well, it's hot stuff.
But today I was all POEC all the time. What I want to say, and it's shitty of me to say this, but I'm going to say it anyway. Okay. I am rarely the less mature one. I'm going to indulge myself. We were saying more than a year ago that we were going to have inflation, and the governor of the Bank of Canada was saying no, we wouldn't. Then he was saying yes, it was, but it was going to be transitory, and we were saying no, it wouldn't be. And then he began to say, okay, it's not going to be transitory, but we'll get it under control. And we said, no, you won't. And then he said it wasn't because of our stimulus spending, and we said yes, it is. At least
I don't know if Macklem. I'm not sure if Macklem specifically said it wasn't because of stimulus spending, but that was the sort of the divide.
Zeitgeist. Yeah,
that was the zeitgeist. Yeah.
And then we were saying it's not entirely because of that. Like, we get that, like, Long Beach, Port of LA is ships lined up for 100 miles every direction. Like, I get it.
But those supply chain issues have been easing for the most part.
And it wasn't all of it.
No.
And people were like, no, it is. And now Macklem's like, no, we overstimulated. We have watched the governor of the Bank of Canada over a period of about 14 or 15 months retreat step by step to where we were in the fall of last year.
Yes, but that's not because we're brilliant or smart. We're just pessimistic. We're just assholes. We're just doers. That's all.
I'm not gonna argue that point. But what I will say is that we have the advantage. Every decision-making loop, and this probably would have helped in Ottawa and Ontario and the feds during the pandemic too. You need someone to be your asshole. You need someone in the loop to be like, yeah, but what if all your assumptions are wrong?
Well, and under that, but the other thing I say is sometimes you can make bad decisions because you have too much data. If you're constantly being flooded with data, it can be almost impossible to separate signal from noise. And sometimes people like us who are layman idiot doomer assholes who are far removed from the actual input signals are a little bit better at saying, but the signal's given us this and the noise has given us that. So I don't know, sometimes that's right.
Well, you know, the old joke about journalism, right? Where, like, normally the joke is if one person tells you it's raining and another person says it's not, your job isn't to report both those things, is to look out a fucking window and see if it's raining. And that's a direct quote, by the way. It was, I think, a British editor. Mm-hmm. And I think that's kind of maybe one of those examples where you and I, whereas the economists would be looking at all their data points being like, is it raining or not? Like, you know, this chart says the 40% chance of rain. This one says 80% chance of rain. You and I are just outside and we're like, it's not raining. Like,
yeah. And we're, you know, grocery shopping and talking to people and like chatting with people at the cashiers and like everybody's complaining about the price of groceries. Like, you know what I mean? Like,
whereas these guys are waiting for the next quarter's data sets to be ready. We're just observing the world and asking questions. We're doing our own research, so that's good. I
think you need both, to be fair. Like, I'm not, of course you do. I'm not anti-expertise because I'm not like you need. But I do think that there's an ecosystem in the feedback loop here that's actually pretty necessary. And journalism is almost like journalism is important or something. I don't know. So there you go.
I think a well-led organization will always have what the military would call a red team. You need someone in-house whose job it is to upset the apple cart.
Yes.
And you know what? Some big corporations have that, right? Like, they have threat assessment groups whose whole
you and I would be great at that. Could we just be that person? Like some major corporation pays us a shit ton of money to be the assholes in the room.
To be the red team.
That would be amazing. Now I've got to go soon, but there's one other thing. There's been two little tidbits in media news that I think I just want to wrap up into one. One, it looks like Bitov and
Rivet.
Rivet
Yep. I
have
don't know.
come to an agreement on who's going to own Torstar. You can hear my children running in the background. That's fine. It is going to go to Bitov.
And he's the guy who wants to spend on journalism.
Yeah, he's the guy who's actually clearly got the touch of God on him and wants to be a serious newspaper publisher, and he's into it.
Hey, as a Torstar
freelancer, that's great. And then the other interesting news to come out of that story is Marina Glagovic is departing ways with the company. Remember Marina Glagovic was
I remember that.
The main character on Twitter a few months ago when it was announced that she was going to become a
bad tweet, right?
Pardon?
Why was she the main character? She had a bad tweet?
Yeah, she had a couple bad tweets, or she had some politically unsavory tweets that the lefties in Toronto started cotton onto. So they're kind of cheering her ouster today. So those two things are worth noting. The other little item worth noting is that, of course, more testimony into Bill C-11 is continuing. No, is it not still C-11 or C-18? Oh, it is C-18. Sorry. Testimony over C-18 was happening, and Lisa Hepner, who is an MP, who I believe is a former Edmonton Journal journalist, starts saying stuff to the effect of, these online news organizations don't cover news. It's the established legacy players whom are the ones who are actually doing the news. So all the online digital companies are just we're just shitty opinion outlets. And as an online company who isn't just does a shitty opinion, hey, there can be value in shitty online opinion. But secondly, it's pretty clear when you listen to her that essentially she has picked winners and losers in her head. She has decided that certain types of journalism is worthy of government support and other types of journalism is not. And I just think that is a really unsophisticated, philosophically problematic position for any former journalist to take.
Also, the line, here's the thing. We are mostly opinion because that's what we can afford to be right now. So please subscribe today. We've been very transparent with people. The richer we become, the more reporting we will do. And we are doing more. We are doing some reporting already. Not a ton. A lot of it is also very voicey first person reporting.
But that's still valid reporting. And then there's something else that Anthony Fury notes here. And that is, every claim that she's making in her testimony here is false. News organizations don't get hauled before the CRTC. We don't. Even credible legacy news outlets are not accountable to the CRTC. Online news outlets are not all opinion only. Online orgs aren't shielded from issues like libel and defamation, as we have discovered to our considerable unhappiness. We're subject to exactly the same standards, journalistically and legally, that any other legacy outlet would be. We are more opinion dependent because we don't have the resources, but that's also true increasingly of a lot of legacy media outlets we could name, that as they start to decline in their own financial viability, they start to lean more and more heavily on opinion writing as well. So there's just a lot of factual errors that are just frankly unforgivable for someone who's a former journalist, and also just a lot of misconceptions in order to further C-18. And I mean, I've written about C-18 in the past. I've testified before Parliament on C-18, and it was also just clear to me that Hepner is not coming at this as a neutral MP. She's coming at this as a partisan hack, and that's just who she is now. So that's fine. But anyway, I just kind of wanted to maybe wrap up those two little bits of media news into one. I think that maybe we could tie it to the fact that I think Beethoven and Rivet had different opinions on C-18. Mm-hmm. It's a bit of a weak tie, but we can maybe pull that into one dispatch. And I think we
pull off weaker ties.
We pull off weaker ties. But I think that gives us one really, really meaty thing on POEC. You probably want to do a bit of victory lap on your cameo at the committee, and I'll do something on Macklem in the media news.
I think that makes sense. So if you do Macklem in media, what I will do is I'll do two-prong POEC. One of them I'm going to do the small victory lap, but I'm going to be mature, and I'm going to note the fact that this is actually a good news story, because even though the Attorney General doesn't like me much, apparently his office still did their job, and that's how it's supposed to be. So but it's
also indicative of just like where these guys think fairness lies. You know what I mean? Like their concept of fairness is not fair, with their concept of fairness is friendly. I think that's worth noting too. So I don't give them full credit.
The modern Liberal Party, in a way that is unique, at least in my experience covering Canadian governments, has a very unhealthy relationship with the media. And you and I talked a little. I mean, here I am going to air just a little bit of our off the record conversations here, but nothing that'll embarrass you too much. We talked a bit about this. We've talked a bit about this before, and I don't believe the Liberals in their current mindset are capable of thinking criticism against them is fair. And I think this is a serious problem for the party. I think it's a problem that gets them into trouble in other areas. I believe the current modern version of the Liberal Party, somewhat in common with previous iterations of it, believes that criticism of them is always unfair. And it's unfair either because it's wrong or because it's not nuanced or it lacks context. And I think the Liberals view the world in friends and enemies. And I think the media is largely an enemy. And I think they talk a better game. I remember not all that long ago when Justin Trudeau was saying, we respect journalists in this country. Yeah, maybe. Look, I got the answers I asked for. I had a very successful communication experience with David Lametti's office, and I'm grateful for it.
Well, but then at the same time, I was like, we're not supposed to be your friends, guys. Like, you're not supposed to like us. That's we're not supposed to be liked. We're not supposed to be liked by anybody. Everybody's supposed to kind of hate us. That's the job.
You're doing the job well when everybody's
doing the
mad
job. Yes. Anyway.
So I will make that one POEC blurb. The meaty one, in a weird way, Jen, I don't know if I have a meaty POEC blurb in me for tomorrow when we'll publish this on Saturday.
I think we just do look, this is the bird's eye view of what we can take away from POEC. And that's it.
I kind of had the feeling, look, I will see what I can come up with, but there is a possibility that I'm going to reflect on this overnight. And what I'm ultimately going to come up with is going to be, we need time to think. There are documents I want to go back and read again. There's a timeline of events as I understood them that I want to now put against the actual broader events. And I don't know if I'm ready yet to commit to writing any broad conclusions. You and I had a really good conversation today. We went deeper into it than I expected to, but I think maybe should we let this simmer a bit in our minds?
I think we need to do something. Like the lead item on the dispatch has got to be POEC.
Well, I think the lead item should actually be the Lametti thing, in a weird way.
That's indulgent. No.
I'm going to write it in a specific way.
No, Matt.
Give me a chance.
Bad Matt.
No. I think I have an idea in my head of how to do this. So let me write it my way and then see if you like it.
Literally just what I was saying in the conversation. Like, look, this is my bird's eye view of my takeaway from POEC, just as someone who has not been following it as closely as you. Just do that.
No, I know. Anyway, I think that's the second longer blurb, but I think I want the victory lap over the paywall.
Okay. Well, you know what? Let's talk about this.
You got to go do family stuff.
I got to do family stuff, and also we got to put a pin in this because we're like an hour and 40 minutes into this podcast, which is fine.
I think it's our longest. Yep,
it's our longest ever. So let's give our poor listeners a break, and we can start this out not on air.
Okay. Thank you, everybody, and thank you, Jen.